isn't so bad for the visual tonight.
Go ahead.
Kind of leading into what you had mentioned, my name is Jay, and I appreciate both of you. I think it was a very nice debate, very cordial, and very educational. My question for you tonight kind of leads to what you had mentioned about, as an atheist, how do you really define sin in your life? Where does the definition come from, and how do you apply it to your life? And would each atheist have the same agreement on what the definition of sin would be?
Okay, good. I don't believe in sin because, as I understand sin, it has a uniquely theological meaning. That is to do something that violates God's laws. Since I don't believe in God's laws, I don't believe in sin. However, I do believe in immorality, that kind of distinction. And since Steve was talking about it, let me talk about that for a little bit. The truth of the matter is that that's a major area of philosophy, doing ethical theory, coming up with different accounts of what it is about a particular act that bestows upon it its moral status. What it is about a certain act that makes it either morally right or morally wrong. And there's a lot of different work on that. There's a lot of different theories about that. The truth of the matter is virtually none of them appeal to God. There is, in fact, one moral theory that's out there called divine command theory that does appeal to God. It was endorsed by a former colleague of mine at Notre Dame, Phil Quinn, for example. But a lot of people don't think it works. And let me give you a couple of reasons why that is. In fact, a lot of Christian ethicists don't think it works. And here's a couple of reasons. They go all the way back to a famous Platonic dialogue called the Euthyphro. And in the Euthyphro, Socrates asks, is something wrong because God forbids it? Or does he forbid it because he sees that it's wrong? Right? You see the difference between the two cases? Now, divine command theory says it's the former. Well, there's a couple of problems with that. If you believe that, let's say, torturing an innocent child is wrong simply because God commands it, then there would be no guidance for God's commands. He just willy-nilly decides to command this and to allow this over here. And God could have just as easily commanded us to torture innocent children. You say, that's the really good thing to do. Now, you might be tempted to say to yourself, well, wait, God would never command us to torture innocent children. But why not? Right? Because according to divine command theory, torturing innocent children is not wrong until God makes a decree about it. It doesn't have any moral status until then. So it puts this arbitrariness in morality that I and a lot of Christian ethicists don't like. That a lot of people would say if you've got a moral theory such that it could turn out to be the case that torturing innocent children is the morally right thing to do, you got a bad moral theory. But let me point out another problem, and this is the one that really bothers Christian ethicists. It seems to make God's own moral goodness a completely uninteresting trait about it. Because notice what it's claiming. It's claiming that moral goodness is whatever God wants. So when you say that God is morally good, all you're really saying is that he wants what he wants. Let me give you an analogy. Let's suppose that there's some tyrant, some leader, and that leader has decreed that anything he wants is legal. So whatever he does is, by definition, in this land, automatically legal. He can steal, he can take whatever he wants, he can kill people, but by definition, it's legal. Now suppose a historian is trying to reflect on what kind of a leader this person was, and suppose the historian says, well, you got to admit he never broke the law. You got to admit he always did what was legal. Well, in that situation, the fact that what he did was legal is completely uninteresting because anything he did was by definition legal. So too now with regard to God's morality. If you simply define morality as whatever God wants, whatever he decides upon, then the claim that God is morally perfect, or the claim that God is a uniquely moral individual, becomes a completely uninteresting feature of him. Because all you're actually saying is, he wants what he wants. So, the bottom line is that there's a number of different ethical theories out there. Utilitarianism is one of them that claims that the moral status of an act depends upon its consequences. Does it cause suffering? Or does it cause happiness? I think all of us are actually, when you think about when you're really confronted with a difficult moral dilemma, how do you think about what to do in that situation? My guess is a lot of you engage in utilitarian reasoning. You ask yourself, will this cause harm to somebody? Will this cause suffering? What will the consequences be? Notice that's how we justify so many of our actions. We justify, for example, the war in Iraq by saying, yes, it's bad, but in the long run, it'll bring about more good things. We focus on the consequences. Well, that's a very compelling moral theory, and it makes no mention to God. It's not relativism. It doesn't say that we just make up morality willy-nilly. It's claiming, no, there's a specific feature that a given act has which bestows upon it its moral status, and that's its consequences. So that's, I think, how an atheist thinks about not sin so much, but right and wrong.
You want to respond to that? Do you want to respond to that?
No, sure.
We can both respond to both questions here. Yeah, I would say that my concept of what's morally right and wrong is not so much based on divine decree as divine character. And that everything that God said is wrong are things that are contrary to his character. That is who he is by nature. Now, it so happens that his character is revealed to be dominated by justice, mercy, faithfulness, and love. Now, if God had been a devil instead and was, characterized by injustice, cruelty, and lying and so forth, I guess there wouldn't be much we could say about it. We'd have to live with that. But we can count ourselves fortunate that the God who made us happens to be committed to things like justice and mercy and so forth. And therefore, every command that he says is good is an embodiment in action of an ideal that is in his character. And everything that he says is evil is the embodiment of an action embodying something that's quite contrary to his character. That would be my take.
You have a question for Steve?
Yes, my question has a origin life direction, and it's how does the fairly common occurrence of errors within self-replication, such as cancers, lend itself to intelligent design?
Well, it depends on whose version of intelligent design you have. If you're looking at Christian theology, which would be where I come from, we believe that God made all things perfect, and therefore there was no direction for them to go but down from there. And there was a downward slide called the fall. That the fate of the universe, well, not the universe, but the fate of the earth, was put into the hands of the original people. And by their wrong choices, they incurred consequences on the whole creation, which had been thorns and thistles and sorrow and grief and things like that. In other words, negative things began to come in, and that the degeneration of that which was once perfect is what we would expect to see. We would not expect to see something that was created originally imperfect but became more perfect as a result of the fall, but rather that the intelligent designer really did intelligently design. Richard Dawkins and Sam Harris and others have pointed out that there are lots of examples of unintelligent design. For example, they talk about newts, salamanders that live their whole life underground, and they have eyes that are blind from birth. They can't see. And they said that's because they evolved from creatures that had eyes that could see. Well, maybe they did. If so, that makes my point. The original design could see. It was not an unintelligent design. What we see today is a degeneration from it, which is exactly what a Christian theologian would expect to see. At least it's the direction we would expect to see things go. That sickness and handicap and mutations. Mutations, by the way, it's hard. Geneticists would be hard-pressed to find one mutation that is unambiguously beneficial to the organism. But they can find mutations by the truckloads that are dangerous and damaging to the organism. So I would say that mutation is simply part of the whole process of degeneration that's now a part of nature. We could even say the law of entropy, although I think some forms of entropy must have been present even before the fall.
Time.
Yeah. Thank you.
I was just going to say, geez, I would think that from the standpoint of the virus, the way they mutate to avoid drugs is pretty beneficial for the virus, and we know that that happens on a pretty regular basis. So we actually are aware of different sorts of mutations that are actually adaptive for the organism. But there's been this about how nature is a tinkerer, and it's sort of it puts together what it can in terms of evolutionary processes. The famous example of Stephen Jay Gould is the panda's thumb, where it's actually a part of the wrist bone, but there was selection pressure for the panda needing the thumb, so this eventually migrated. It doesn't work very well, but it works okay. It does a pretty good job. And for Darwin, that was indeed part of the evidence for evolution was the fact that there was so much poorly designed stuff in this. And so I think that that's actually, any evolutionary textbook would be filled with examples of exactly that kind of thing. There's a great movie you mentioned, the Sam, or what's with the...
Ben,
yeah, the Ben Simon. There's another really fun movie I'd recommend called Flock of Dodos, if you haven't seen it. And it was all about the Dover trials, what took place there. And it's pretty middle of the road. It's not really taking sides so much. But there's a lot of discussion in that movie about how in the animal kingdom we see so many things, so many types of stomachs and things like that just really don't make sense. They're not what you'd expect to find if an intelligent God decided to just create these things whole cloth, but they make perfectly good sense if you see how this came about through this sort of accidental, but guided accidental process of evolution.